Welcome back to the channel. With the release of the 12-inch Anne Fitzpatrick doll through the virtual doll convention last month, I have been sewing like crazy. My sewing skills have certainly evolved and improved over the years, and I thought I'd share with you some of my top tips for finishing a sleeveless dress. Although there are numerous ways to end up with the same result, in this video I'll show you some things that I've found to make my sewing projects a little bit easier. Once you've selected your pattern and your fabric, I'd like to show you some easy ways to turn that bodice, finish the lining to the waistband, hem the garment, as well as do the back closure. Let's go ahead and get started. As you can see from the array of dresses shown on the table, I really have been sewing like crazy. You can see our three main character dolls that we have listed right here. This is the Anne-Marie Fitzpatrick doll, which is a 12-inch doll released through the virtual doll convention. This is the 14-inch Patience doll that was released through Wild Imagination, who shares the exact same body as the Anne doll. And this is Tonner's original 12-inch Marley. And there is some variation between these two body styles and how their garments are going to fit. So if you stay with me till the end of the video, I'll explain it near the end. When creating a sleeveless dress, you might have varying pattern pieces that you'll be working with. As you can see from the three stacks we have here, we have three different bodice pattern pieces that we're starting with. This is a single piece bodice where the front and back are connected at the shoulder seam. In the center, we have one where you're using a front of the bodice and two back sections. And the final piece right here is from the Friends pattern, and it actually has princess seams, so the front has two and the back has two as well. Once you get the bodice front and back sections sewn together at the shoulder seam on any of these styles, you're going to go ahead and use the same finishing steps to create an excellent garment. As we walk through the steps of the sleeveless construction today, I'm going to be using the Playtime pattern that's available for Anne. It's also available for Marley and the Patience doll as well. I'm choosing a really light cotton fabric as the exterior portion of the dress. I've chosen an appropriately small print so that it looks good on the doll, and then I've also just chosen a really lightweight cotton for the lining of the bodice. To get our Playtime dress constructed, we'll look at the pattern pieces briefly, which include the bodice piece, the upper ruffle, as well as the lower ruffle. To get the bodice constructed, we'll place the lining to the bodice with right sides together and pin around the neck edge opening as well as the armhole opening. If you're new to sewing doll clothes or you are new to the channel, I would like to remind you that on the patterns for dolls, the seam allowance is 1/4 inch. There are more than one ways to finish a garment, but I'd like to share with you the way that I do it. So if you notice the back of this dress, I refer to this finished edge side as the left back opening. And then I place my snaps in between, and I finish the right back opening with a serger or zigzag stitch along the right back opening. And I'll show you that construction going forward. To achieve that back closure, I sew around the neck edge and down the left back opening. I stop that seam more than 1/4 inch from the waist edge of the dress because I am going to turn the lining under. I also sew around both armhole openings, and once I have those seams in place, I'll show you how I turn the bodice right side out. As you can see, I did stop more than 1/4 inch from that finished edge, and I also back stitched here to make sure that I could secure that seam. When you are sewing the sleeveless top, you do want to keep another thing in mind which is critical, and that is that you use a very small stitch length. Generally, I use between a 2.5 and a 3, especially when I have to turn through a small shoulder channel like this. Another thing you may have noticed when I was sewing is that I don't hesitate to lift up my presser foot on my sewing machine as I'm going around those rounded corners. Depending on what type of sewing machine you're using, you may find this to be very advantageous. With our lining sewn to our bodice and using that 1/4 inch seam allowance around the neck edge and the armhole openings, we're going to clip and trim in towards the seam allowance and cut it down a little bit. I will caution you that if you're using a looser weave fabric, you don't want to clip the seam allowance too close, or you might actually pull through the seam as you're turning the garment right side out. These are my favorite tools. This is a fast turn tube turner, 1/4 inch, and this is just a doll stand. Our goal in turning it is to take those back sections and pass them through the shoulder channel to the front of the dress to get it turned right side out. I'll take the tube turner in through the front of the bodice and through the shoulder seam. Once I get back there, it doesn't matter which one, you're gonna pick one layer, either the front or the back. I like to go to the back corner. I place the doll stand right in the tip, and then very carefully and with patience, you slide it on through the tube turner until you see it on the other side. A very important point here is you don't want to yank it out. You can pull the seams. You can also get really stuck into that shoulder channel. So you just want to take a little bit of time and finesse and ease the fabric out really easy, even single layered if you can. And there we got it. You want to make sure to check both sides to make sure you in fact didn't pull those seams. And once everything looks to be good, you can go ahead and do the second side. From here, the next step is going to be to press the garment, and then we're going to get the side seam sewn. This is another invaluable tool. This was a gift to me from my mom. I think it's used to run elastic through casings, but I'm not even sure what its original purpose is. This is what I use to poke the corners out on my garments. For our bodice construction, you do want to confirm that both shoulder channels are equal width, and you also want to make sure that you've done a good job ironing it so that the lining of the dress is not showing to the exterior portion of the dress. To get the side seam sewn on the bodice, you're going to do the side seam by opening up both the front and the back and placing the front of the dress to the front of the dress and then the lining to the lining. We'll get those side seams pressed open. With the side seams pressed open, we're going to go ahead and turn that lining up 1/4 of an inch all the way across the bottom. When you get to that left back opening, you want to make sure that you maintain that fold in, which is the seam allowance, and then the fold up. As we look at the inside of the garment, we can see that the left back opening is the finished edge, the lining is turned under, and all the way across we have the raw edge on the right side. We're going to set the bodice aside for a moment and prepare the layers of the skirt. The dress shown on Anne is the same dress that we're constructing, therefore we're going to be using an upper layer as well as a lower layer. In order to get it started, the first thing we want to do is hem one long edge of that lower layer. My preferred method for hemming is to run an overlock stitch along the long edge and then turn it up 1/4 of an inch and top stitch it. If you don't have a serger, you can easily use a short zigzag stitch to achieve a similar result. We'll take the lower ruffle over to the sewing machine and top stitch right along that hem. Then I'm going to run a gathering stitch along the top raw edge of the ruffle, and then I'm also going to run a gathering stitch across the top raw edge of the upper ruffle. When it comes to gathering the ruffles, you can use either a single layer or a double layer of stitches. For a simple ruffle, I may choose to use just one stitch, and in that case I do it a little bit less than 1/4 of an inch from the raw edge of the ruffle. When I'm creating a dress or a skirt with a little bit more volume to the skirt, I tend to use 2 gathering stitches. In that case, I would place the second gathering stitch more than 1/4 of an inch from the first gathering row. To get the ruffles added together, I actually just place a quick press mark to the center of the ruffle so that I can find the direct center of both pieces. So I'm going to place them right sides together at that press mark indicating the center. Next, I'm going to gently pull the gathering stitch to match the width of the upper ruffle. When you have the ruffles evenly distributed and pinned together, you're going to sew them in place. With our ruffle layers sewn together, I'm going to press that seam allowance up. But before I do, what I like to do is run an overlock stitch all the way across the raw edge of the ruffle, and then I like to top stitch it in place. I'm also going to do a overlock stitch along the left back opening of the side. I'm going to press that seam allowance up and top stitch along the ruffled edge. We have a finished left back opening on the skirt assembly. We have a finished left back opening on the bodice. We have a raw right back opening on the bodice as well as on the skirt assembly. So I'm going to do the same thing I did with the layers, where I folded in half to find the actual center. Then I'm going to match that center to the center of the bodice, pin it right sides together, and pull the gathers to match. When you have all the gathers equally distributed across the waist edge of the bodice, I want to show you what it looks like on both the right and left back opening. So on the raw right back opening, we've actually lined the raw edge of the skirt directly up with the raw edge of the bodice. On the opposite side, where we have that finished bodice edge on the left back opening, we've opened it up so that we're lining up the overlocked stitch of the skirt assembly to the raw edge of the bodice. That way, when you set your waist seam in place, that's going to fold under and match up with the finished edge of the left back opening. When you're sewing the waist seam, you do want to make sure that you press the lining back so you don't catch that in your sewing seam. With the waist seam sewn, you're going to check both sides, and then you're going to press the seam allowance up. The next step that I like to take is to overlock the right back opening of the dress and bodice section. You can also use your zigzag stitch here. We have to turn in the left back opening to match the finished edge of the bodice, and that's going to give us our 1/4 inch seam allowance for the center back seam. At this point, I'm actually going to finish the lining to the waist using my sewing machine and creating a top stitch. You have that secondary option of actually grabbing a needle and thread and hand finishing the lining to the dress if you're more comfortable with that approach. The next 2 steps will have our project finished. So the first thing that we're going to do is place it right sides together and sew the center back seam from the hem edge to the dot as indicated on the pattern. Now, 2 things you want to keep in mind when you're doing this is you want a nice clean edge at that hem, and you also want to make sure that the ruffles are lining up on the back of the skirt as well when you get that pinned in place. With the center back seam of the dress sewn, we're going to take our seam allowance and press it to the left. From here, we're going to grab one of our dolls and get a quick fit to mark the placement of the snaps. When I sew the snaps on my finished garments, I like to start with the side that has the finished edge. When I do that, I'm being extremely careful not to run the thread through the outside of the garment so that you can see it. I generally go through each hole in the snap 1 time, and then that first snap hole I go into 1 more time before I actually tie the thread off. Once I've gone through that last hole again, I actually tie the thread off into a knot, and before cutting it, to make sure that the snap is quite secure, I take the end of the thread and I just run it through the material 1 more time before I cut it. I'm going to sew the rest of the snaps on and get a quick final picture of our project. As you can see from the final photographs, we took a few pictures both on the Patience doll as well as the Ann Fitzpatrick doll. If you're a frequent sewer for dolls of this size, you can use the same patterns for the Ann doll as well as for Patience. If you had a chance to check out the unboxing video of Ann, you'll see that the Marley Wentworth doll is slightly different. There will be a slight variation between the Ann and Marley patterns, as Marley Wentworth is a little bit thicker through the torso. If you're interested in learning more about the Ann Fitzpatrick doll that was recently released, please look for the link to the virtual doll convention listed in the description below. Thank you guys so much for stopping by today. I hope some of the tips for construction of the sleeveless dress were helpful to you. As always, I thank you guys for your time and watching. If you have any questions, please list it in the comment section below. Hit that like and subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video.